Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on economic mobility strategies for HUD subsidized housing residents. We're excited to bring you this webinar today. My name is Rebecca King. I'm the Acting Director of Policy for the National Housing Conference. I have a few brief introductory comments, and then we're going to dive into today's presentations. First things first, I want to thank our two speakers today, Sherry Riva and Adrian Todman. Sherry Riva is the Executive Director and founder of Compass Working Capital. Adrian Todman is the President and CEO of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. And you will hear from both of them shortly. The National Housing Conference is committed to connecting the housing community with the resources you need to move housing forward. Given recent and ongoing discussion at the federal level around how to encourage self-sufficiency for HUD residents, and what are effective strategies that could be deployed, NHC wanted to host a webinar focused on strategies already being used by housing providers in the field, like the Family Self-Sufficiency Program and other strategies that public housing agencies are deploying around workforce development and Section 3. So Sherry Riva is going to bring us a presentation focused on family self-sufficiency, and then Adrian Todman is going to give us some insights into what PHAs are doing on the ground right now. We are going to close with Q&A, but please send your questions as they come to you during the presentation. Just a quick note on some technical details. We are recording the presentation, and assuming technology works as it's supposed to do, we will make a copy available on our website. We will also email everyone who registered for today's webinar with a link to access the recording. And we hope to do that by early next week, if not sooner. So Sherry and Adrian are going to be delivering their presentations with slides, but we will also be using video during Q&A, so you can actually see them. So just bear with us as we work through some of those technical pieces. You have the option in your screen in your GoToWebinar drop-down menu to see the video feed of the panelist who is speaking, or all of the panelists, or none. So you have some control there. And just a reminder, all of the attendee lines are muted to ensure clear sound quality for everyone. And again, please feel free to send questions through the question box throughout the webinar presentation. If you do run into any issues, with GoToWebinar, you can use the Help menu at the top of the GoToWebinar control panel to locate technical support. You can also visit the GoToWebinar support website. So with that, bear with me while I pull up Sherry's presentation. All right, Sherry, I think we're ready for you.
Great. So good afternoon. My name is Sherry Riva, the Executive Director at Compass Working Capital. Wanted to thank you, Rebecca, and the National Housing Conference for the opportunity to be a part of today's webinar. It's an honor to be on today's webinar alongside Adrian, whose work I respect so much, and just great to be with all of you here today. Thank you for your interest. I'm excited to share a bit about the work we're doing here at Compass on integrating economic mobility strategies into subsidized housing. So let me just start briefly by telling you a bit about Compass. Next slide, please, Rebecca. We are a nonprofit financial services organization, and we are focused on supporting low-income families to build assets and financial capabilities as a pathway out of poverty and to broader economic opportunity. At Compass, our work is rooted in and informed by the asset building field, a growing field which really focuses on the importance of assets and promoting economic mobility and financial security for low-income families. Our core model provides financial coaching, high-quality financial coaching and savings programs for families. And since our inception in 2005, we have done that work in a variety of contexts, but for the past 7 years, have really focused our efforts on serving families who live in federally subsidized housing through a program called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which I'll spend quite a bit of time on today's webinar telling you more about. But first, next slide, please, Rebecca. First, I would like to just begin with a story. The best way to understand what we do and its impact is through the experiences of the families we work with here every day at Compass. So today I would like to introduce you to Rosa Paulino, whose picture you see here. Rosa is a graduate of the Family Self-Sufficiency Program that we operate in Lynn, Massachusetts in partnership with the local public housing authority. When we met Rosa in 2013, she had been in the Housing Choice Voucher or Section 8 program for about 15 years. When we met Rosa, she was working full-time and she had always dreamed of owning her own home, but it was never something she thought she'd be able to achieve. When Rosa enrolled in our FSS program, she was matched with a Compass financial coach. The coach worked with Rosa to review her financial situation, identify her goals, and help Rosa chart a path to reaching those goals. Most importantly, the FSS program also gave Rosa a chance to build savings through the process of paying her rent, which I'm going to tell you a bit more about when we get a little further in the webinar. And let me just comment briefly on our coaching model here at Compass. Those of you who might know our work, we talk passionately about being client-centered in what we do. This means that we meet families where they are, and we believe in their ability to define their own goals and transform their own lives. So the FSS program is typically a 5-year program, but for Rosa, the journey was much shorter. It took her just about 2 years to graduate, and at that time, Rosa gave up her housing voucher and moved into her own home in Lynn. With support from her coach, she had improved her credit, paid off her bills, built savings, and learned more about the home buying process. And the quote here on the slide tells you a bit more about what that milestone meant to Rosa. When she graduated, she also went on to help several of her siblings purchase their own homes, a way of passing on what she had learned to others. Next slide, please. So I start with Rosa's story because it frames so powerfully our work at Compass and what we believe. First at a high level, our work begins and ends with a fundamental and unwavering belief in the families we serve, mostly women, mostly mothers who dream of a better life for their families. Rosa embodies the aspirations and drive and integrity that we see every single day in the families we serve. We combine this core belief in people with a commitment to the role that assets play in helping people escape poverty. We know that assets matter because they provide a cushion in times of economic distress, and assets provide the capital that all of us need to make investments in things like education and homes and businesses, the things that move our families forward. And yet, as many of you know, many of you on this webinar likely know, our anti-poverty programs in this country have traditionally done very little to help poor families build assets. And in fact, for families in our public welfare system, rules actually discourage and penalize savings, often creating traps that make it difficult for families like Rosa's to lift themselves out of poverty. And this is what brings us to the FSS program, HUD's Family Self-Sufficiency Program. And I want to tell you more about why Compass, an organization in the asset building field, came to focus its efforts on this not well-known federal housing program called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. As many of you on this webinar likely know, when you live in subsidized housing, your rent is tied to your income, typically at 30%, which is a policy that it was designed to keep housing affordable for those who receive assistance. The unintended consequence of the policy is that it can create a disincentive for some families to increase their income. Working more means you pay more rent, you might lose other benefits tied to your income, you might even be afraid of losing your housing assistance, and despite a fundamental and deep desire to get ahead, families like Rosa's often feel trapped. But the FSS program, which was authorized by Congress in 1990 and administered through HUD, changes the incentive structure through a simple idea, which we try to capture here on this slide. As families work and earn more money, the FSS program allows them to capture their increased rent payment in a savings account that's held in escrow by the housing authority. So effectively, the FSS program converts an increased monthly rent payment into a monthly savings deposit, and families can use this savings, which builds monthly over a 5-year period, to achieve their financial goals, just as Rosa did to become a homeowner. Next slide, please. So I want to just pause and say that FSS is an extraordinary model. If you hang up from today's webinar, there's one thing I want to make sure you understand, which is there is really no other anti-poverty program like it in the country, one that provides a built-in savings and asset building mechanism to participating families. It is the federal government's largest asset building program for low-income families, and there is no statutory cap on how many households can participate or how much they can save. Historically, though, HUD has framed the FSS program primarily as an employment program, a program really designed to help residents increase their earnings. And yet at Compass, the more we learned about the program, we hypothesized that an asset building model for the program could drive stronger results for families and help expand the program's impact around the country. And the slide that you see here just helps lay out some of the key components of how we do this work at Compass. And I would say most importantly, we focus on integrating client-driven coaching along with the strategic use of this FSS account to advance the household economic mobility. And in 2010, Compass became the first nonprofit in the country to launch an asset building model for the FSS program, starting with the local housing authority here in Massachusetts. And today we are serving about 1,200 families in FSS programs through partnerships across New England. Next slide, please. So I want to just, as we always do at Compass, just take a moment to share a little bit about what we're learning and the impact we're seeing. Last year, Apt Associates completed a rigorous multi-year evaluation of our work, the partnerships we have here in Lynn and Cambridge, Massachusetts. You can see here some of the results of that study. Overall, the study found that participants in the Compass FSS program earned more and received less welfare payment than their match peers, and they also achieved positive credit and debt outcomes that exceeded benchmarks. Just last week, Apt also released an interim cost-benefit study, which demonstrated a pretty impressive return on investment, with the study demonstrating a high level of benefit to participating families compared to a very small cost to government and Compass to administer the program. Both of these studies are available for review on Apt's website, and you can see the link there at the bottom of this slide if you're interested in learning more. Next slide, please. So just commenting briefly on building on our local success in New England, in 2016, we launched a national training and technical assistance model to support mission-aligned partners across the country to implement aspects of the Compass FSS model in their local communities. The list here on this slide captures our entire footprint of our work, including both the sites where we operate programs directly in New England, as well as where we support partners in our national network to implement the program. I want to make sure I point out that the partners in our national network include private owners, public housing authorities, and other community-based nonprofit organizations. And our model of support to partners in the national network is highly tailored. For example, for private multifamily owners who are starting new FSS programs, our team provides customized guidance on how to launch an FSS program, on-site training on coaching and FSS program management, where for public housing authorities, our team can provide an assessment of your existing FSS program, as well as a plan for strengthening your existing program and integrating financial coaching and asset building strategies in your work. And importantly, in both cases, our partners have access to on-demand technical assistance at Compass and really become part of a growing field of partners who believe, like Compass, in the importance of investing in families and leveraging housing as a platform for economic mobility. In the time I have left, just a minute or two here, I did want to comment briefly on the opportunity for private owners, multifamily owners, to operate this program. What may not be clear to everyone on the webinar is that the FSS program, when it was authorized in the early 90s, it was only made available to public housing authorities. But in 2015, the Obama administration extended eligibility to offer the FSS program to multifamily owners that administer project-based rental assistance. This extension actually took place through the appropriations process, but there's legislation that recently passed the House and is now working through the Senate that would make this authorization permanent. And so you can see here just a kind of snapshot of one of our partnerships on the multifamily side. In 2015, Compass partnered with the Preservation of Affordable Housing to implement our FSS model at 4 of their properties, PBRA properties. And as you can see here from the slide, the early results have been very strong. The demand and enrollment among households has been high, and initial financial security incomes also across income, reduced unemployment, and increased credit scores are encouraging and impressive as well. And as I said at the beginning of my remarks, our interest at Compass is in expanding the scope and impact of the FSS program around the country. We see a lot of opportunity in the multifamily market to do this, especially since to date, very few owners have taken advantage of this new authority to offer the program since it was extended just a few years ago. Next slide, please. And I'm looking forward to taking questions later in the webinar, but I did want to note that we would welcome the opportunity to engage more with organizations one-on-one after today's webinar. If you're interested just in understanding broadly more about the FSS program, how our model works, or more on the national network. I also wanted to mention that we are finalizing a launch course for multifamily FSS and expect that to be available next month. That course distills what we've learned to date about launching new multifamily programs and will help standardize and streamline the process. It provides modules that are tailored for key stakeholders involved in program launch and ongoing operations. And so, anyone interested in learning more about the program or our work can reach out directly to the national network listed here, or feel free to email me directly. And let me just close by saying, I think at a time where we're talking a lot about inequality in this country and the importance of wealth building, we see the Family Self-Sufficiency Program as a promising and still underutilized mechanism to help low-income families in our nation's federal subsidized housing system build wealth as a pathway to broader economic opportunity. And with that, I'll stop here and turn it back to you, Rebecca, for the next part of the webinar.
Thank you, Sherry. That was great. We are going to turn things over to Adrienne now. Give me 1 second to pull up her slides. All right. Adrienne, are you?
I'm right here and ready to go.
Awesome. All right. Except I went to the beginning and not to your slide, so bear with me. There we go.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to be with you today. It's an active day here in Washington, D.C., as you can imagine, with the omnibus bill making its way through our legislative system, and more on that later. But I also want to thank Rebecca, thank you, and to thank the National Housing Conference for this opportunity to share some information and entertain some questions about mobility and workforce and sometimes educational programs that housing authorities across the country have created and really empowered over the past several decades. Housing is a platform, and I think we have talked about that a lot, particularly in the past several years, but it wasn't always that way. Housing was not always seen as a platform, and just take a little journey with me. The public housing program, as many of you will know, was created in the 1930s, and then it was really only available to heavily screened working class families, and back then also significantly segregated, not just in its production, but also in its operation. But over the years, and particularly as we got toward 1970, the people who lived in public housing began to change. And one significant change was that many families who were living there had lower incomes or were fixed incomes versus the public housing's previous history. And that began to put a strain on the entire housing portfolio as we began to look at how to actually sustain the operation of public housing. And along the way, manufacturing jobs left and good living wage jobs disappeared. And so we began to deal with a population of residents who were more and more marginalized, not just in terms of their access to jobs, but really even jobs being available. And today we see that across the country, the average income for a household in public housing is roughly about $12,000 household. The Section 8 program, or as it's called now, mostly the Housing Choice Voucher Program, was created in the 1970s, and as most all of you know, provides rental subsidies in market rate apartments. That program matured probably within the past 20 years in residents or participants being able to use their subsidy toward mortgages, and it's also the original home of what Sherry was referring to, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. Today, the average income across the voucher programs is roughly about $14,000 a household. So as the program progressed and people in both programs began to become more disconnected from what appeared to be mainstream educational workforce opportunities, various programs across several couple decades were created to re-thread those relationships. Next slide. And that's where we have the journey of mobility programs. Now, I have been in the industry for more years than I will admit, but been around long enough to see various iterations of programs that were created by HUD to try to help move the needle when it came to mobility and economic opportunity for families. Some of you may remember the old EDSS program. Many of you probably don't. It was short-lived, but was a very flexible program that allowed housing authorities to not just do everything from microloans to childcare. The Tenant Opportunities Program and its successor program, which is ROSS, was also a program that was directed toward resident councils that empowered resident councils to do neighborhood and site-driven activities to benefit the families that live there. And then one of my favorites, the Public Housing Drug Elimination Program, which many of you will recall was the quote-unquote midnight baseball program back in the day, but also really provided a lot of anti-drug activities in terms of exposing particularly our youth to other activities that hopefully would open paths for them, and was also a big contributor to security operations at housing authorities. Perhaps the one program that really opened up our minds and thoughts about the possibility of public housing acting like a platform for mobility and for change is Hope 6. And Hope 6 was originally created as just a redevelopment program, but over the years, the concept of having supportive services were deeply driven into the entire membrane of Hope 6, where the intent, and I emphasize intent, was to have families have upward mobility as the neighborhoods were changing. There have been many studies about the ups and downs and flaws and opportunities about what was called then the Hope 6 Community Supportive Services Program. But it was really one of the first early attempts to comprehensively look at how can housing, this portfolio, really serve as a jumping off point for families in a number of social needs: health, education, and workforce. Today, we have the ROS program, which is directed mostly toward resident councils, and with the omnibus is going to be funded in FY18 at $35 million, which is flat funded. We have the wonderful Family Sufficiency Program, which Sherry just spoke of, which will also be funded at flat funded this year at $75 million. And then Choice Neighborhoods, which is loosely a successor program to Hope 6, and it received a boost up to $150 million for FY18. And then Jobs Plus, which is a very place-based program that very few housing authorities across the country have had a benefit of, but really takes a very holistic neighborhood approach to how to help families move on. Next slide. Sherry just spent a lot of time talking about family self-sufficiency. I just wanted to add to that housing authorities over the past 25 years, FSS is now 25 years old, have really been the pioneers in being creative with this program. It's important to note, if you're not familiar with FSS, that what HUD pays for is a coordinator to actually do the coordination. It does not actually pay for the frontline services. So housing authorities have to, at the ground level, be very creative in terms of local partners that include either their other local government sister agencies or other nonprofit entities that actually work with housing authorities to help families where they are. And I think Sherry said it best. Sherry said it best, that one of the strengths of FSS is really meeting families where they are. When I used to administer the FSS program, it was wonderful to hear the different variations of what success meant at the family level, which is really where it counts, and families being able to create their own goals is a very important aspect of this program. But the strength of it is the escrow accounts, as Sherry just mentioned, and it's something where families begin to see the incremental amount of money that they are earning over those 5 to perhaps 7 years. It really inspires them to work harder and to work faster to achieve their goals. And it is one of the smallest programs that we know of, and that's funded inside of the HUD budget, but I dare say it's one of the most powerful and one that I can't wait to see grow and has many, many different opportunities for families across the country. I'm going to spend more of my time talking about 2 other aspects of the mobility work inside of the Public Housing Authority space. And the first is Section 3. Now, Section 3 has gotten some of a bad rap from time to time because it is effectively a requirement. It is certainly an unfunded mandate, but it can also serve as a powerful tool. And what Section 3 does is, it is Section 3 of the Housing Act of 1968, and it effectively says that if you are funded by HUD, particularly vendors, they are funded by HUD, there is an obligation that you as a vendor have to either hire public housing residents or other low-income people who reside in the area, or to actually operationalize and bring on certain Section 3, what are called business concerns. And you see the statistics there in terms of what a business concern is. One of the things that I found with Section 3 is that if your partners, your private sector vendors know that this is a part of how you do business at the contracting level, then you will find vendors will adapt to the level in which you want to engage them on having Section 3 jobs and businesses available. And those private sector vendors are key, and they're a critical partner in operationalizing Section 3. And there are various ways that housing authorities have actually deployed their funds. The Capital Fund, which is to do major rehab at public housing sites across the country. Typically, some of those funds are procured out to private vendors. And my experience has been that sometimes those vendors, when there is a strong relationship and Section 3 requirement that's in place, will hire residents, either who are provided by the housing authority or who present themselves to the company for potential jobs. The same can be true in our redevelopment work. At the Allegheny County Housing Authority, for instance, they had a $17 million redevelopment project, and they were very they worked very closely with their contractors and subcontractors, and were able to have almost 40 of their residents who were hired doing that redevelopment work. In Cincinnati, at the Cincinnati Housing Authority, same thing. They created a very initial targeting initiative working with smaller companies who fall into the Section 3 business concerns, and realize that unless they begin to nurture relationships with some of these smaller companies and to teach them how to compete, that they would not be successful. So they took the time to create that relationship in Cincinnati. Some of the issues that I found in Section 3 that creates challenges is resident readiness. Again, Section 3 is a legal requirement. It does not come with funds for the Housing Authority to actually deploy workforce development work or educational work to make sure that residents are ready. So what I found is that even though the opportunities may be there contractually, sometimes some of our residents are not ready yet for the types of jobs that may be available. So I think that's some place that we can all work on across silos and figure out if these jobs are available, how do we make sure that our residents are prepared for them. Another place that I've seen some issues in terms of deploying residents to jobs is in licensing, particularly in the home health care area. There are many individuals who are very interested in higher technical skills, but there sometimes is a very robust process for individuals to be licensed at the child care level, at home health care level, other levels, that sometimes acts as a wall or a veil from the resident being able to get the kind of job that they would like to get that's available. And then job tenure. The typical relationship in Section 3 is where a housing authority enters into a contract, a job is available, but sometimes that contract ends, and it should end. And when it does, that is sometimes an opportunity where a company will suggest that the job has also gone away. So I think job tenure and trying to find ways to have sustainability paths for individuals who are doing well in their Section 3 is another area, I think, for improvement. Next slide. Another space where there's been aggressive work on the mobility path is with our moving to work agencies across the country, of which there are 39 with another 100 that's been authorized by the Congress. And moving to work agencies have really looked at the mobility space in two ways. One, they have far more flexibility than the average housing authority to actually deploy resources that will support service work or services that will support work. How do they do that? Within the Moving to Work program, the funds that are received by HUD are fungible. And when they are creating their budgets, a Moving to Work agency may decide it is an important part of our budget to make sure that our families have access to education networks and workforce networks so that they're able to improve the economic situation of their family. So certainly being able to pay for services and bringing in vendors, or really housing authorities who may look to hire in-house and create those support networks on their own. It is certainly one way that many housing authorities that are moving to work have tried to make sure that their families have certain skill sets that they need. Another way that moving to work agencies have looked at the mobility is incentivizing work through rent reform strategies. So what does that mean? You heard from Sherry that rent for a family is based on 30% of adjusted income inside of the household. Sometimes that can act as a disincentive to either creating opportunities for more work inside of the household, or even reporting additional work that may be occurring in the household. And by simplifying the rent structure so that at each point that someone in the family household is making more money, that individual does not have to run to the housing authority to report it and thereby get a what I'll call quote unquote work penalty for actually finding a job, a better job that is better paying. They are able to keep some of their proceeds and stay inside certain income bands or be at a tiered rent level. Some of these rent reform strategies have been looked at as perhaps being punitive. I see these rent reform strategies as most of the time allowing families the space that they need to improve their economic situation. In fact, the MDRC and HUD are working together on a multi-year study at about 3 or 4 moving to work agencies right now, where the rent level inside the voucher program, where the rent level for the household has been set looking backwards in terms of what kind of income was coming into the household. And basically over the course of several years, if the household does improve its income situation, or there are family members who are added to the lease that would then potentially increase the rent for the family is held harmless in terms of additional rent. On the flip side, there is a hardship provision that all of these agencies have put in place for those families that are experience hardship with that demonstration. So that work is underway, and I certainly am very excited to see what the findings look like and how reestablishing a rent platform may incentivize families to do other things. I certainly direct everyone who's listening to 2 important reports on moving to work that speak in far more detail than I am here on some of the work that's being done. One was conducted by App Associates and the other by the Public and Affordable Housing Research Corporation, or PRAC. You can find those reports on NARA's website, and you can also find it on APT and PRAC's website as well. Finally, last slide. Finally, sometimes folks are not moving to work. Sometimes it's not a Section 3 strategy. It's not even family self-sufficiency. Sometimes you have agencies that are just very mission focused and want to make sure that their families are doing well. And here's some examples of those. At the Lake County Housing Authority, they realized that many of their kids weren't having access to good, quiet reading moments. So they created a family literacy night where it's a good old book club concept, but with the entire family involved. At the Fort Worth Housing Authority, where they're doing financial coaching through their lending circles, where they're actually helping to increase credit scores. The Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development's Open Works, where they've created a business incubator space that is helping do even digital fabrication. Our friends at the County of San Bernardino have a strong partnership with their workforce development force, where they've hired almost 300 residents in the past 3 years. And the Freeport Housing Authority's Teen Force, where some of our teenagers, who sometimes you got to focus that teenage energy, they're teaching them soft skills to just prepare them as they enter adulthood and they're able to compete in the workplace. So those are just some of the examples outside of family self-sufficiency where housing authorities are really pioneers and breaking ground on mobility initiatives. If you would like to see additional information on everything I've said, please feel free to visit our website at nahro.org, NAHRO.org, where we have a brand new workforce portal where you will find information about housing authorities that have done things such as work requirements and time limits, and also some of the research that's out there on workforce development. Thank you, Sherry, and thank you, Rebecca. I'll end there.
Thank you, Adrienne, and thank you, Sherry. And we are going to open up for questions. And we've already gotten a couple. And as Sherry and Adrienne both turn on their webcams, I did want to mention a couple things for folks as context. One, Sherry mentioned a really important bill, or provision of a bill, I should say, that would make the expansion of family self-sufficiency to project-based rent assistance properties permanent. So this is a provision of S2115. It's the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. This is a bill sponsored by Senator Crapo. It has bipartisan support. It is now in the House, and they are discussing what pieces they would like to see added to the bill. So it's still a little uncertain if it's going to move forward. And I will say some of the pieces of the bill as they relate to the financial industry are controversial. But the FSS piece is part of the bill. So we are hoping that that moves. So I want to make sure you are aware that's S2115, the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. And that would be a big step forward because for a lot of private owners, they don't have access to service coordinator dollars, so it's a big investment. So they need some certainty that this program is going to be around for them to participate in. So I just wanted to highlight that and also flag, as Adrian said, the omnibus bill is finally out. You can see NHC's press statement and see that public housing finally got a plus up of funding, which is good. It's hard for them to take on extra services when they're just trying to maintain units. So that is the tension and the balance that public housing is trying to navigate. And that's why part of NHC motivation for holding this webinar was to point out that there's a lot of talk about how we can help HUD residents move up and out. But PHAs have been working on this for a long time, as have developers, and we've got lessons we can already learn and best practices we can glean. So we shouldn't lose sight of what's already happening in the field. And we can use those models in our advocacy for more resources to do this really important work. So with that, we will open up for questions. And as I said, we have a couple already, but please send more. I want to start with one for Sherry, but I'm going to reframe it a little bit actually for Sherry and Adrian around the Family Self-Sufficiency Program and outcomes for families. The specific question was around how many families actually move out of subsidized housing. So please touch on that, but also just, you know, some of the positive outcomes more generally that you're seeing.
Sure, I'm happy to start with that question. So in our model, we are seeing right now tracking about 40% of graduates move on from subsidized housing either to homeownership or to market rental housing. I think it's really important to point out that those outcomes depend pretty fundamentally on geography. It's much more challenging to make an exit out of subsidized housing in a higher cost housing market. So, but important to point out, as we often do, while not the goal of the FSS program, and we don't think that receipt of escrow, for example, should be tied to exit, the desire of most families coming in is to make a positive exit out. It has to be an affordable exit, and that continues to be the challenge. So sort of macro cost issues related to housing. So that's a little bit more than the question was answering or asking, but about 40% to date is what we're seeing among graduates.
So I'll add to that. What my experience has been that most families that are exiting subsidized housing through FSS did have home ownership as a goal, but there's a little catch to that. Usually they're exiting their rental situation and moving into a home ownership situation, but still using the voucher subsidy to help with the mortgage. And what the escrow account has been used for is a down payment. So these escrow accounts, if it's wildly successful, I have found $20,000, $30,000 is considered a good, healthy escrow account. But that's not enough money for a low income or lower income family to strike it out on their own, particularly in high rent areas, as Sherry alluded to. So some of these goals are tied around education. Some of these goals are tied around improving someone's job situation or lack of employment situation. There's still more work to do in terms of actually exiting assisted housing, but certainly that is geographically based, and it's very difficult for someone to leave it if there's really no other rental platform that is affordable to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point. I think that you both raised about the affordable housing stock in a local market, because if there's nowhere to graduate to, that's a problem. Even if folks, you know, are close, if rents aren't affordable, why would they leave that situation to be unstably housed? and gets to our overall stock challenges of affordable housing. Switching gears a little bit, for both of you, I think, to weigh in on, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program by design is voluntary. So a lot of families are motivated. They seek it out once they find out about it. At least that's been the historical model. But what about families with challenges, mental and physical health needs, or educational, I don't want to say limitations, but just, you know, maybe they haven't finished high school yet, that kind of thing. How are you connecting with those residents? How are you seeing PHAs or multifamily owners reach these harder to reach, for lack of a better word, populations?
So I'm going to start, but I want to actually start at the end of the last question very briefly, because if you're listening and watching us right now, you're thinking, what's the point of FSS graduation if you're not exiting? And I will tell you that if someone is in the voucher program and they are paying a little bit more or a lot more of their income toward rent, it actually decreases. It decreases on the housing authority side the amount of subsidy they need to pay to the landlord. So there are net wins for both sides of the table. As relates to the question, you know, people do self-select, and I'm sure Sherry will describe that even further. People do self-select in participating with the program. And what I found is that it would be great to be able to reach families who didn't self-select, but who there is potential and there's an opportunity there. It's just that the funding to do that and the capacity for most housing authorities to really take on as many people as they would like is just not there. So sometimes they can only take on those families that self-select in and want to do well and help improve the trajectory of their kids. But there are families and individuals who may have physical disabilities who are readily participating in the program. I think that what you may have is some families who are probably not as engaged with some of the services that's happening with the housing authority in town who may self-select out. And Sherry sure has something to add.
Yeah, so I think this is an important question. I have sort of 2 or 3 responses that I'd like to share. So I do think what we see, we call sort of early adopters on the program. So families who are opting in, they're ready to participate, they're self-selecting into it. We actually don't necessarily refer to those families as being more motivated than other families. What we're really thinking a lot about are who are we reaching and why, and who aren't we reaching and why. And we actually recently just wrote a grant to help us take a look at, I shared this earlier, high enrollment rates in the communities that we're in, which, you know, we feel good about, and yet we're still asking this question of who aren't we reaching? And we don't really know that until we take a look at, is our FSS population, for example, representative of the PHA's overall population? Or, so for example, I think right now we have challenges reaching younger mothers with younger children. The average age of our participant is 41 years old, a woman with school-age children. So why aren't we reaching younger women? Why aren't we reaching more men? Are we reaching families who are working, who have disabilities and would like to participate? Are there ethnic groups that were not our, you know, sort of our outreach? We haven't made inroads into those communities. The question about, you know, sort of our assessment at intake, a coaching model doesn't mean we're not having conversations with families about the other, quote, non-financial things that are going on for them. In fact, part of meeting families where they are is simply meeting them where they are and understanding what is the entirety of sort of assets and challenges that any given family is bringing to the table. And so we have a lot of community partnerships, as most FSS programs do. The program coordinating committee, of course, is a structure designed to help do that. So we have referral partnerships. Think that piece of the work is important too. And one other sort of innovative model we have seen with one of our national partners, this is actually in Maine with Portland Housing Authority. on their public housing side, they actually have a model where they have families who aren't quite ready from an employment point of view to enroll in FSS. They use the Ross program to provide some general support and resident service support to residents, and then refer families from the Ross program to the FSS program. So a bit of a kind of pipeline. The reason not to enroll all families right away in FSS is if you have 5 years to build escrow, you want to make sure that families have the opportunity to be working fairly soon at the beginning of their enrollment, or else, you know, they potentially miss some of the upside of the escrow accumulation. So I thought that was an interesting model that seems to be working. So Ross helps stabilize families a little bit more of what they need, and then they get referred into the FSS program in Portland.
No, that's great. Those are all really good responses, and I think that's right. And I'm glad you challenged my characterization, Sherry, because I think that's part of the work we all need to be doing. Most families are actually motivated. Some may have more to overcome than others, but just because they're not at the front door doesn't mean they're not motivated to improve their circumstances. That's an important piece. Before going on to a couple other questions before we close, I did want to share Anisi, who runs the FSS program at HUD, had some national statistics that folks might find interesting. So 32% of FSS program graduates exit rental assistance within 1 year of leaving the FSS program, and 12.5% went on to purchase a home. And the average escrow account for families who graduate is $6,500. So that's nationally for all families participating in FSS through HUD. So just good things to keep in mind. So an interesting question around any experience with combining FSS with housing choice voucher, housing mobility counseling programs, and what you're seeing work or not work in those partnerships.
Right. I think they work hand in hand, but they're not necessarily. But they're not necessarily tied at the hip. So with mobility counseling, the intent is to help families find areas of opportunity or areas within their larger city or county or town where it's not a traditional neighborhood for a voucher client to live, and there needs to be some nurturing of landlords and perhaps some even introducing participants to neighborhoods to encourage them to live there. So typically what I found is that families who are staying in place, who may get mobility counseling but opt to stay in the neighborhoods that they are still showing up at the front door to participate in FSS programs. And I don't know if, Sarah, you have a different experience.
No, I really don't have anything to add there.
Thanks. I thought that was an interesting question that I hadn't given a lot of thought to. And then more of a clarifying question, but for folks who are newer to FSS, do all FSS participants need to have a goal of home ownership?
No.
No, I'm so glad you asked that, and Adrian and I are both shaking our heads. I do think, I mean, there's some history there too under earlier administrations where that really became a focus of it. And, you know, as Adrian and I both mentioned, I would say the majority of families who want to exit are interested in homeownership. But I think one of the challenges I think that has been hard with enrollment at times is this fear or association that if I enroll, I'm going to have to give up my voucher, even though that's not true. There's this, you know, sort of lack of trust and a fear, which I think families in our welfare and housing systems rightly are navigating all the time. So sort of building trust and meeting families where they are, whatever their goals might be. For, you know, we track where escrow dollars go. And upon graduation, dollars are unrestricted, which is also what makes the FSS program so powerful. We think that's important because it honors, again, that families have the ability to transform their own lives and make good decisions about where those dollars might go. And we see things that, you know, I mentioned earlier, families are investing in their kids' education, they're investing in their own education, they're buying, in smaller cases now, buying cars to get to work, they're pursuing home ownership, they're opening emergency savings accounts, they're saving for retirement, they're pursuing job training. Those are the categories of savings we typically see at graduation. So it is definitely not a requirement, but I still think we battle a little bit that people associate it exclusively in that way.
Yeah, and I would just add, you know, that's absolutely correct. Homeownership is not a requirement, and some families opt into it. But what I found to be very powerful within FSS, and Sherry can probably appreciate this, I've been to many, 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 many FSS graduations, and there's hardly one where I didn't tear up a little bit. Because one of the biggest success I see coming out of this program is people's ability to actually believe in their own ability to do something when they thought that they couldn't. And whether that was home ownership, whether that was getting the car, whether it's helping pay for my kid to go to college, my big walkaway every graduation is that you have changed their entire outlook because they are now inspired and have a higher confidence in themselves to do better. And that to me is one of the most powerful, successful indicators that there can be.
Yeah, I just really quick, Adrian, to sort of chime in on that. It's why I started with this story of Rosa, who the reason I mentioned that she'd been in housing for 15 years is because when we met Rosa, it was extraordinary to me, given how much capacity she had to do this work, that somehow the system hadn't invested in her ability to do it. And not only did she do it, she's teaching her kids those skills. And then, you know, and Adrian, every time Rosa speaks, I cry, and I've heard her story dozens of times. But Rosa, as I mentioned, actually then went and supported her siblings. She has a large family, and I think she helped 2 or possibly 3 of her siblings to become homeowners. And so when you have that belief in yourself and tap into it, you actually pass that on. The work isn't for Compass to do this or a housing authority to do this in every community, but really building up the capacity in families and communities to do this work on their own. And I don't think there's a better success than that. So I appreciate, Adrian, you mentioning that. In the end, it's really not the physical asset per se, although of course those are things that really do help people move forward. It's this belief in being able to do it, and then passing that on to people you work with and love and are in community with.
That's right.
I think that is a great point, especially for people who have felt disinvested or neglected by their community, their society, giving them a reason to think differently. So our closing question, I'm going to get to in just a second. We didn't get to all of your questions. I have made notes of them, and we'll follow up with Sherry and Adrian and try to get you all responses because we got so many questions, which I'm not surprised, and I'm thrilled to see the interest. But we just don't have enough time. So I'm going to ask one last question, which is, how can you get your PHA to start an FSS program or a multifamily owner in your community? Like, you can talk that through just briefly. Or maybe barriers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one barrier in terms of having your program funded by HUD is access to funding for the FSS coordinator. So as a housing authority, you are allowed to start your own FSS program. Now, whether or not you will receive funding to pay for our FTE, a coordinator, is really just subject to what HUD has available. And like I said, even for FY18, with the boost that we got in the omnibus, the FSS program is still at 75 million, which is pretty much where it's been, and correct me, Sherry, for the past several years. So I see getting access to coordinator funding as a barrier, particularly for cash-strapped housing authorities. But you can still create an FSS program working closely with your local government and nonprofit partners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add briefly, this is a space we've done a lot of work in with both PHAs and multifamily. And I agree with Adrian, the constraint are the service dollars to hire the coordinators, who are the frontline staff who are doing this work with families. We have had experience with and would be happy to support other partners in doing this. have found that philanthropy is a really good partner here because of the leverage provided by the escrow accounts. And this is true even for one of our public housing authority partners has a, kind of a nonprofit arm associated with the housing authority, so they're able to raise money, or we're a local nonprofit raising it on behalf of and in partnership with the housing authority. So we use philanthropy to hire the staff who do the work. And then the housing authority is able to administer the escrow accounts, which when you're a philanthropist saying, well, I want to work with families, I want to promote economic mobility, the idea that you're helping families build, as we heard from Anisi, $6,500 in savings is a lot of leverage. So those are strategies we've done a lot of work on, and we'd be happy to help and support other PHAs or owners on the call who are kind of thinking about whether they could think through a revenue or a funding model to do this. We'd be happy to be helpful there.
Thank you both. That was a great way to close out. There are some challenges to starting an FSS program, but there's also opportunity and ways to make it happen. And encourage you to reach out to Sherry and Adrian as you're thinking about that in your community. With that, I'm going to close us out. I want to thank everyone for attending today and for your great questions. I want to thank Sherry and Adrian for partnering with us on this webinar. This was better than I could have hoped. I learned so much and really appreciate your insights. And just gives us a lot to think about as we start another round of advocacy for the HUD budget. So with that, I will release all of you back into your day. And just again, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca. Bye, Sherry.
Bye, Adrian.